I never asked for gratitude. I didn't expect flowers. I just helped. I wrote checks for their mortgage, paid for the grandkids' medical bills, gave without keeping count. And then, during a family dinner, my daughter-in-law smirked and told me to stay out of their finances. I smiled in return, and the next morning, without a word, I logged into my online bank account and pressed one button. Freeze. If they're so grown and independent, let them handle it on their own now without my money. And believe me, the silence in the house after that was worth every penny. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name is Margaret Hoffman. I was 69 years old and living in Colorado Springs in the same modest 2-story home my husband and I had bought almost 4 decades earlier. The neighborhood had changed over the years. New families, new cars, fewer porch conversations. But the house remained the same. It was filled with soft carpets, clean windows, and the quiet hum of a life lived deliberately. Since retiring from my position as a hospital accountant 8 years ago, my days had slowed, but never lost their shape. I had always been a woman of order. I balanced my own checkbook by hand every week. I clipped coupons even when I didn't need them. I saved grocery receipts in monthly folders and kept a spreadsheet that tracked every expense to the cent. It wasn't obsession, it was reassurance. My mind trained over 35 years of managing budgets felt most at ease when the numbers lined up. I wasn't rich, but I was secure. After my husband passed, I was left with a life insurance policy, a reliable pension, and more than enough savings to live comfortably and help where help was needed. Helping had never been a question. It was part of who I was. My son Daniel had married young and started a family early. He and his wife Amanda had 2 children, bright, energetic boys who brought light and chaos into every room they entered. They lived about 20 minutes away in a development with wide roads and manicured lawns. I saw them often enough to stay close, but not so often that it ever felt like an obligation, at least not at first. Over the years, I had contributed quietly, consistently. When Daniel and Amanda bought their first home, I gave them a sizable check to help with the down payment. When they had their first child and were overwhelmed with medical bills, I paid off a portion of the hospital charges. When daycare became unaffordable, I rearranged my schedule to babysit twice a week for nearly a year. I never asked for anything in return. I didn't want thanks or grand gestures. I only wanted to feel useful, relevant. That desire to remain part of their lives, especially Daniel's, was something I rarely admitted even to myself. After all, he was my only child. I had poured my energy into raising him with discipline and warmth, into giving him the structure I never had growing up. His independence had always made me proud, but it also stung a little when he pulled away. So I found my own ways of staying connected. A check in the mail, a casserole on the porch, a deposit into their savings account when I noticed their balance dipping low. Something I could see through a shared bank login Daniel had set up years earlier for emergencies. Amanda had always been polite. She thanked me when she remembered, smiled when it was convenient, but I knew without being told that she didn't quite like how often I was involved. She was careful with her words, but her tone always shifted when money was mentioned. I once overheard her tell a friend at a birthday party that I was too involved for someone who doesn't even live with us. I pretended not to hear, but the words lodged themselves somewhere behind my ribs and stayed there. Still, I kept helping not to buy affection, not even to win favor. It was what I believed mothers did. They gave, they stepped in, they filled the gaps quietly so no one else had to. I convinced myself it was love. Maybe it was. I spent a lot of mornings at my kitchen table with a cup of Earl Grey, reviewing my budget, calculating how much I could afford to gift, without dipping into my retirement too heavily. I never jeopardized my own future, but I gave generously, always leaving room for more. I paid their property taxes twice. I covered the cost of braces for their oldest son. I paid for a family trip to Disneyland when Amanda was laid off. I even added Amanda to my A plan after her car broke down twice in 1 month. These weren't favors, they were extensions of care. I told myself that being needed was a blessing, that their reliance on me was a kind of connection. Even when Amanda's tone grew cooler, even when Daniel stopped mentioning the help to others, even when their thank you notes stopped arriving. One evening, I reviewed my latest bank statements and noticed a transfer larger than usual had gone through without any heads up. It wasn't for a mortgage payment or a hospital bill. It was a credit card payment. I stared at the screen, unsure if I had authorized it. Technically, Daniel had access to the account, but something about it felt different, assumed casual, like my bank account was now considered part of their monthly toolkit. I didn't say anything that night. I closed the laptop, washed the dishes, and went to bed. But something in me shifted. That quiet pause, the one I used to feel when I was about to offer help, suddenly became a question. Was this still kindness, or had it quietly become permission? And if it was permission, what exactly had I allowed? The changes started small, so small that at first I convinced myself they were nothing. Minor lapses in etiquette missed thank yous. Awkward silences where there used to be warm appreciation. I reminded myself that people get busy, that children, jobs, and mortgages all make it hard to maintain the rituals of gratitude. I didn't want to be the kind of mother-in-law who counted favors, but I did begin to notice a shift in tone, a subtle withdrawal of warmth that had once buffered every request. It began with access. Years ago, when Daniel and Amanda were newly married and struggling to manage their finances, Daniel had asked if I could set up a joint account to help them with certain bills. The arrangement was supposed to be temporary, just something to help cover emergencies and cushion them as they adjusted to life with a mortgage. I agreed, not out of obligation, but because I wanted to make things easier. Back then, he asked before touching anything. Every transaction came with a phone call, a thank you, an explanation. But those phone calls stopped. The explanations faded, and one day I checked the account and saw that the monthly transfers I had set up for their mortgage payments had been rerouted, no longer going to the lender, but instead to a personal credit card in Amanda's name. I stared at the screen for a long time, double-checking the routing information. I had not been informed of the change. No one had asked. No one had told me. The money had simply been moved. I didn't say anything. I told myself they must have needed it for something urgent. I waited for Daniel to mention it. He didn't. A week passed, then another. No call, no message, just silence. Later that month, I overheard Amanda on the phone while I was visiting. I was in the hallway putting away coats when I heard her in the kitchen talking to a friend. Her voice was casual, unguarded. She said, honestly, we'd be fine if his mom would stop acting like our bank. I wish she'd just butt out already. The words hit like a slap, not because they were angry, but because they were dismissive. I stood frozen in the hallway, holding a coat that suddenly felt heavier than it should have. I didn't confront her. I didn't let on that I had heard, but something inside me pulled back quietly and decisively, not out of vengeance, out of self-preservation. From that point on, I started to pay more attention. I noticed how Amanda flinched when I brought up money, even in passing. I noticed how Daniel became evasive whenever I asked about how things were going financially. They had started treating me like an intruder in a space I had once been invited into. One afternoon, I offered to help them file their taxes. It had been a tradition for years. I was good with numbers, patient with forms, and had always made sure their deductions were maximized and their paperwork submitted early. But this time, Amanda looked up from her phone and said, "We've got it covered." There was no eye contact, no warmth, just a firm line drawn in the middle of what used to be shared ground. I told myself again that maybe she wanted independence, that I should respect that. But even when people want distance, there's a way to ask for it. There's a way to be gracious. What I was receiving wasn't a boundary. It was a shove. That week, I removed myself from the joint account and opened a new one in my name only. I didn't tell them. I simply shifted the funds and reset the passwords. I didn't cancel anything, but I left it clear. If they needed help, they would now have to ask, and I would have to decide. But the real break came not in silence, but at the next family dinner. We were sitting around the table. The boys were playing in the living room. Amanda poured wine and laughed a little too loudly at something Daniel said. It should have been an easy evening, but something felt strained, like a performance being held just long enough to make it through dessert. I mentioned a small financial article I had read about interest rates going up and asked if they had locked in their refinancing. Amanda put her glass down and without even a trace of hesitation said, "Margaret, we've got our finances handled. You really don't need to be involved." Her voice wasn't harsh. It wasn't even sharp. It was polite smiling, but final. Daniel didn't say anything. He looked down at his plate. No one else moved. It was as if the temperature in the room had dropped 10 degrees. I nodded, slowly, took a sip of water, and changed the subject. The conversation drifted elsewhere, but I felt something inside me begin to freeze. Not rage, not pain, just a quiet, internal click. A door closed. I stayed for dessert, helped clean up, kissed the boys goodnight, and left like I always did with a smile and a thank you and a wave from the porch. But as I drove home in the dark, the headlights cutting across the empty roads, I knew something had changed. Not just in them, in me. I had spent years giving without question, offering, without conditions, trusting, without hesitation. Now I was beginning to ask, where is the line? And what happens when the people you've trusted most pretend it never existed? Thanksgiving had always been my favorite holiday. There was something comforting in its rhythm, an entire day shaped by gratitude routine and the smell of cinnamon and sage. I had hosted for years until I passed the torch to Daniel and Amanda after the second baby was born. I had done it gladly, thinking it would give them space to build their own traditions while still keeping me close. I had imagined laughter-shared recipes and the smell of turkey carrying the same weight of love it always had in my house. I was wrong. That year, I arrived early. I always did. I liked to help set the table, fold the napkins, make sure the gravy didn't burn. I had baked my usual pumpkin pie, homemade crust, extra nutmeg, just the way Daniel liked it as a child. When I walked through the front door, the house smelled like warm butter and rosemary. For a moment, it felt familiar. Amanda was in the kitchen, arranging a cheese plate, her movements sharp and precise. Daniel was carving the turkey with his back turned to the room. The boys were running in circles, shrieking with sugar already in their veins. I smiled, greeted everyone, placed the pie on the counter, and offered to mash the potatoes. Amanda nodded, but didn't make eye contact. It was a small thing, but I noticed. Dinner was served buffet style, a new tradition Amanda had insisted on a few years ago. Less formal, she had said, which really meant less of me at the center of the room. I took my plate, found a seat at the far end of the table, and listened as the conversation bounced around the room without me. They talked about local politics, school updates, upcoming renovations. When I tried to join in, it felt like I was threading myself into fabric that had already been stitched closed. And then it happened. It was such a casual moment, a throwaway line, really. I had asked gently about the new car I'd seen in the driveway. Amanda smiled, tilted her head slightly, and said, "Yes, we figured it out ourselves. We've started managing our own finances now, Margaret. You don't have to worry." The way she said it, it wasn't rude. It wasn't angry. It was polite, pleasant, the kind of tone that hides its sharpest edge behind a smile. There was no confrontation in her face, no raised voice, just a cool certainty. And the room didn't shift when she said it. No gasps, no awkward laughter, just silence for half a beat. And then Daniel cleared his throat and asked his oldest to pass the bread. I stared at her at the table at the cloth napkin in my lap. My hands didn't shake. I didn't flinch. I nodded once and took a sip of my water. But inside, something unspooled quietly, a recognition. That tone was a door closing, not slammed shut, just softly, irrevocably. No one looked at me after she said it. Not really. Daniel didn't meet my eyes. Amanda went back to sipping her wine. The conversation moved on, and I sat there with my plate half finished, pretending I was still hungry, pretending I was still part of the evening. I helped clear the dishes after dinner. I packed up the pie, even though no one had touched it. I folded my cardigan over my arm and stood by the front door while the boys showed me a Lego spaceship they had built earlier in the day. I smiled, kissed them on the forehead, and said thank you to Amanda. She nodded, told me to drive safe, and shut the door behind me with mechanical finality. In the car, I sat with my hands on the steering wheel for a few minutes before turning the key. I didn't cry. I didn't fume. I just thought about all the meals I had cooked, the bills I had paid, the quiet support I had offered over the years. I thought about how easy it had become for them to distance me with a single sentence, a single tone. That night, back in my kitchen, I placed the untouched pie in the refrigerator and sat at my own table. It was smaller, quieter, less filled with voices, but it was mine. The chair didn't feel empty. It felt safe. I made a cup of tea and sat with the silence. It no longer scared me. The difference between kindness and control had always been blurry for me. I gave so much because I wanted to be useful, loved, needed, but Amanda's tone at that table had pulled the curtain back. She hadn't asked me to stop helping. She had told me in the nicest possible way that I was no longer necessary, that my presence was no longer valuable, unless it came with silence and distance. And so I began to consider what that meant. What did I offer that they felt so free to dismiss? What did I still give that they assumed they could keep receiving without a single ounce of respect? I set my empty cup in the sink and stood for a long moment in the dark kitchen, hands braced on the counter. The house around me didn't feel empty. It felt like mine again. And slowly, very slowly, I realized something that would shape every step I took next. If they no longer wanted me in their finances, then they would get exactly what they asked for. Every penny, every line item, every account out of reach. The next morning, I woke early. The sun hadn't fully risen yet, and the kitchen was still wrapped in that soft blue quiet that makes everything feel like it's holding its breath. I sat at the table with a cup of coffee, staring out at the frost clinging to the edges of the window, thinking about the sound of Amanda's voice from the night before. The words had played in my head all night like a record I couldn't stop. And with each repetition, they carved a little deeper into something I hadn't known was already cracked. We've started managing our own finances now, Margaret. You don't have to worry. There, it was pleasant, dismissive final. And it was time I treated it as exactly what it was, permission. I finished my coffee, took a deep breath, and walked to the drawer in my desk where I kept my banking notebook. It was old-fashioned maybe, but I liked paper. Inside were all my logins, passwords, account numbers, security, question answers, all written in neat block letters, triple-checked, and updated monthly. I opened my laptop and signed into the main account where the joint savings was still technically active. They probably hadn't thought I would do it. Maybe they assumed I'd sulk stew, maybe bring it up during a phone call, and then let it go like I had so many times before. But this time, something had changed. I wasn't reacting out of anger. I wasn't trying to prove anything. I was simply doing what Amanda had so clearly asked, staying out of their finances. I began with the savings account, the one where I had deposited a few $1,000s each year for family expenses. A generous cushion that had gradually become a bottomless well for forgotten invoices, spontaneous vacations, and shopping sprees. I never questioned out loud. I transferred the full balance to my personal account, one Amanda didn't even know existed. Then I closed the joint account entirely. The confirmation came in a polite blue pop-up: "Your account has been successfully deactivated." Next came the auto payments. There were 3 recurring charges linked to my credit card: the boys' music lessons, their internet bill, and a premium Netflix family plan. All 3 had been added casually over time, never directly requested, but quietly assumed. I went into the settings and turned off each one. No explanations, no announcements, just clicks. Each cancellation felt like a stitch coming undone from a costume I no longer needed to wear. Then I changed the password not just for my online banking, but for my email, my cloud storage, my Amazon account. Every space where Daniel might still have saved access just in case was secured. I updated my password manager and removed him from all shared files and financial folders. It felt like locking the door after realizing you'd left it open for far too long. I pulled out a separate folder from my cabinet, one labeled Estate and Legal. Inside were documents I hadn't looked at in years: my will, my trust plan, medical directives. It was all still valid, but outdated. Daniel was listed as my executor, Amanda as my second point of contact. I stared at their names in black ink, suddenly aware of how far my trust had once stretched. I made a note to call my attorney the next morning. The rest of the day moved in silence, but it didn't feel heavy. It felt intentional. I cooked myself lunch: grilled cheese and tomato soup, just like I used to make for Daniel when he was sick as a boy, and ate at the table while sunlight finally broke through the window. The house was warm and quiet, the kind of quiet that no longer carried shame. In the afternoon, I went through the shared Dropbox folder where Amanda had uploaded photos from birthdays and holidays. I downloaded the ones I wanted: pictures of the boys blowing out candles, of Daniel with frosting on his cheek, of me holding a turkey with pride, and then removed myself from the folder. It was a digital goodbye, subtle and silent, but necessary. Before dinner, I checked my phone. No messages, no missed calls, no panicked emails about frozen transfers or declined payments. I suspected it would take at least another day for them to notice, and when they did, I wasn't sure who would reach out first. That night, I opened a fresh notebook and wrote in big, firm handwriting across the first page: "I am allowed to close doors without guilt." I underlined it twice. I watched a movie alone and laughed out loud, not to prove anything, just because it was funny. I watered my plants before bed and stood for a long time at the window, looking out over my yard, the grass silver and still. The porch light clicked on automatically, as it always did. It was something my husband had wired years ago. A small piece of control passed down without needing permission, and as I turned off the lights and climbed into bed, I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel punished. I felt calm. I felt restored. I had been asked to stay out of their finances, so I did. I simply didn't tell them I was taking everything with me. By the second day, the silence became noticeable, not loud or jarring, just oddly shaped. It floated around me like fog, like the kind of quiet you hear when the air has changed pressure, but no storm has arrived. I moved through my routines the same as always: morning tea, local news, a walk around the neighborhood. I waved at the mailman, nodded to the woman walking her terrier. Everything on the outside still looked the same, but the air had changed. No texts from Daniel, no calls. Amanda, of course, had never been one for communication unless it involved logistics, but even that had stopped. There was no polite reminder about the next piano recital, no shared calendar invite, no group photo of the boys in mismatched sweaters. Nothing. I told myself this was exactly what they wanted: autonomy, distance, boundaries. The word Amanda had said so clearly: "We're managing our own finances now." She might as well have said, "We're managing without you," and I had given them exactly that. Still, I found myself checking my phone more often than usual, watching the screen light up with every notification that wasn't them. A grocery store sale, a weather alert, a dentist appointment, reminder, but no names I knew by heart. I started baking again. It was something I used to do when I needed clarity. The smell of flour and cinnamon, the rhythm of kneading the timer ticking down. It made everything feel measurable, predictable. I made banana bread, cranberry scones, a batch of molasses cookies I hadn't thought of in years. I wrapped some up in parchment paper and left them for my neighbor's teenage son who had just started college. He sent me a thank you text with too many emojis. It made me smile. One afternoon, I walked to the small park near my house. I sat on the same bench I had used when Daniel was a toddler, back when I'd bring juice boxes and peanut butter crackers in a plastic container, back when he thought I could fix anything with a hug and a Band-Aid. The swings squeaked the same way, the breeze moved the same way, but I was not the same. I thought about the invisible labor we do as mothers, the way we give and give, not because we're asked to, but because we can. And when that labor is quietly absorbed, when it becomes expected instead of appreciated, it begins to weigh differently. It stops feeling like love and starts to feel like quiet erasure. I didn't regret helping them, not for a moment. I regretted not drawing the line sooner. I regretted thinking that love without boundaries was the same as love without limits. I had written too many blank checks, emotional, financial, practical, and they had been cashed without hesitation. Later that evening, the silence cracked. A text from Daniel. Just 3 words. Did something happen? I stared at it for a long time. He didn't call. He didn't ask directly. Just that passive message floating in my inbox like a balloon bumping against the ceiling. I didn't respond immediately. I finished my tea. I read 2 chapters of my book. I folded laundry. When I finally answered, I wrote, "Just honoring your request." I sent it and turned off the phone. I didn't need to elaborate. If he understood, good. If he didn't, that wasn't mine to fix anymore. That night, I slept with the window cracked open. The air was cold, but clean, crisp, the kind that reminded me of autumns before the world became complicated with grown-up disappointments and unspoken resentments. The silence was still there, but it no longer frightened me. It had become a choice, one I could live with, one I could own. He showed up on a Wednesday. There was no warning, no call ahead, just the familiar crunch of tires on gravel, the dull knock on the door, and Daniel's outline behind the screen. He stood with his hands in the pockets of his jacket shoulders, slightly hunched, like a child waiting outside the principal's office. It had been weeks since I'd seen him in person, maybe longer, though I had stopped counting. I opened the door without a word and stepped aside. He walked in and stood awkwardly in the entryway, eyes darting to the living room, then the kitchen. I asked if he wanted coffee, and he nodded. I made it without asking how he took it. I had known that since he was 12. We sat across from each other at the kitchen table, the same table where I had once helped him with math homework, the same table where I had once laid out brochures for his college applications. It was a table full of ghosts, none of them angry, just tired. He looked older than the last time, or maybe I was just seeing him differently. His hair was thinner at the temples, and he had new lines around his mouth. He cradled the mug in both hands and said thank you too quietly. For a long moment, we didn't speak. Only the ticking of the wall clock filled the room. Then finally, he asked the question, or rather, the approximation of one. Why did you do it like that? It wasn't accusatory. It wasn't gentle either. It just sat there unshaped, as if he couldn't quite decide if he was hurt, or confused, or just surprised that the balance had shifted. I didn't answer right away. I let the silence hold, it stretch, it deflate it. Then I said, because I was asked to. Nothing more. He looked at me like he didn't understand, but I think deep down he did. He just didn't want to admit it. He leaned back in the chair, fingers tapping the mug eyes, scanning the corners of the room. He didn't ask about the accounts. He didn't mention Amanda. He didn't bring up the way I had slowly closed every financial door he used to walk through so freely. He circled around the subject like someone afraid to step on something sharp, but he never truly landed. And I didn't offer anything more than what was requested because for years I had done exactly the opposite. I had filled every silence, solved every inconvenience, anticipated needs before they were voiced. I had made life easier for him in ways he hadn't always noticed, had perhaps come to see as normal, expected, built into the structure of our relationship. And now, sitting across from him, I realized that the greatest thing I could offer wasn't help. It was distance, not coldness, not punishment, just space. There was a moment when I saw something flicker in his expression, a memory maybe, or a reckoning, but it passed before it could settle into anything real. He set the mug down and asked if I was okay. I nodded. He nodded back. And that was the closest we came to touching the truth. The question he didn't ask was the one I had waited for, the one that might have sounded like, did I take too much? Or did I stop seeing you? But those questions remained unspoken, lodged somewhere behind pride and habit. Eventually, he stood to leave. He didn't finish the coffee. He said he'd call soon. I said, all right. We walked to the door together. I opened it. He hesitated like he wanted to hug me but didn't. Instead, he stepped outside and turned back just once to say thanks for the coffee. I nodded again, then gently shut the door. I leaned against it for a while after it clicked shut. Not sad, not angry, just still. I thought about how many times I had waited for him to ask what I needed, and how many times I had convinced myself it was selfish to want that. But now the silence between us wasn't filled with resentment. It was filled with boundaries, ones I had built out of necessity, brick by brick, word by word, withdrawal by withdrawal. And it wasn't silence I feared anymore. It was the erasure that used to live in the noise. That night, I sat at the kitchen table alone, poured myself another cup of coffee, and wrote a single sentence in my notebook. Love is not a lifetime of unpaid debts. I didn't cry. I didn't ache. I just let the words sit there true and simple and mine. Let the questions remain unasked. I had already answered them for myself. It was the quiet that stayed with me, not the silence of abandonment or anger, but the slow unfolding quiet that arrives when something finally settles into its true shape. I no longer checked my phone out of habit. I no longer hovered near the mailbox waiting for invitations that never came. There was no announcement, no dramatic unraveling, just the steady absence of expectation. And with that absence came a strange relief. I reorganized my finances the way I used to organize my filing cabinets back in the hospital office, calmly, methodically, with clean tabs and zero emotion. I set up automatic payments only for the things I used. Utilities, property taxes, internet. I removed every trace of shared access. No more third-party authorizations, no more family logins, no more shared subscriptions. There were accounts Daniel and Amanda probably didn't even remember I'd opened for them. A small college fund I had once created for the boys, quietly building interest. A retail store card I'd use for back-to-school clothes when money was tight. I closed them all. I dissolved the fund and redirected the money into a certificate of deposit in my name. I removed their names from the emergency contact list at my credit union. I erased myself from their financial safety net as thoroughly as they had erased my voice from their decision-making, and no one noticed. No call, no email, not even a complaint when the streaming services stopped or the bank declined a card. That was what struck me most. How easily I was absorbed into irrelevance. I had spent years being the invisible glue, quietly holding together birthdays, bills, holidays, and health insurance premiums. And now, without a word, it all continued. The machine didn't stop. It just recalibrated. That was the moment I realized something I hadn't let myself admit before. I had been replaceable all along, not as a person, not as a mother, but as a function. They didn't need me. They needed the version of me that gave without question, the one who filled gaps without drawing attention to the fact that the gaps even existed. I had become a background system, Reliable silent, always on. Until I wasn't. And when I went offline, so to speak, the silence didn't echo. It just stayed. I started filling my days with things I had once set aside. I joined a small ceramics group at the community center. My hands were clumsy at first, but the clay didn't judge. I signed up for a short memoir writing class at the library. I met women my age who didn't apologize for being complicated or cautious. We drank lukewarm coffee and laughed about things our children would never understand. One morning, I drove to a nearby town I hadn't visited in years. I wandered through antique shops and bought myself a pressed glass bowl I didn't need. I had lunch alone by the window of a small diner, eating slowly, reading a novel, not answering to anyone. For the first time in a long while, my time felt like it belonged only to me. When I returned home that evening, there were no messages, no updates. The house was still, and I was too. There was something empowering about no longer being useful in the way I had once been. It made room for other kinds of usefulness to myself, to strangers, to things that didn't come with blood ties or history weighed down by assumption. I began donating small amounts to causes I cared about, quiet contributions with no recognition attached. I sent a new set of art supplies to my niece's daughter in Oregon just because she told me she liked to draw. I didn't wait for thank yous. I didn't need acknowledgement. The joy came from choosing where I placed my kindness. That was the difference now. Everything I gave was by choice, not reflex. I wrote that line in my notebook that night. When they only miss what you give, they never truly valued who you are. I stared at it for a long time, and then I underlined it. Twice. The next morning, I sat on the porch with my coffee watching a squirrel leap from branch to branch across the backyard. The sky was pale and soft, the air cool against my skin. I breathed in slowly and exhaled through my nose, letting the stillness anchor me. They would be fine without me, and I would be more than fine without their need. It began like any other day, a gray morning sky, the kettle whistling softly in the kitchen, the same creak in the floorboard by the sink. I moved through the motions without hurry, without the weight I used to carry of being needed, of staying available, of being quietly ready to help just in case. Those instincts had once been my compass, but now I had a new one. After breakfast, I opened my laptop and logged into my bank accounts, not to worry, but to check to affirm to see my name where it belonged. There were no surprises, no unauthorized charges, no mysterious transfers, just numbers in neat rows, each of them tied to choices I had made. I closed the browser and sipped my tea, slowly letting that sense of calm settle deep into my chest. Later, I cleaned out the hallway closet. I found an old binder filled with documents from a different season of my life, tax returns from a decade ago, medical bills I had already paid, receipts for gifts long forgotten. Buried near the back was a manila envelope with copies of the checks I'd written to Daniel and Amanda over the years, tuition, mortgage assistance, holiday bonuses I disguised as just a little help. I flipped through them slowly, not with regret, but with clarity. They had needed me once, and I had been there, but they had never asked who I was when I wasn't giving. And now that I had stopped, they had stopped asking anything at all. I burned the envelope in the fireplace that afternoon. It wasn't anger that made me strike the match. It was ritual, a way of closing the loop, of clearing space for something else. Control, I realized, wasn't just about money or access. It was about narrative. I had allowed others to write parts of mine for far too long. Quiet edits, made in exchange for closeness, small erasures in exchange for belonging, but no more. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with a pen and a sheet of clean paper. I made a new list, not of groceries or bills or appointments. This time, it was a list of boundaries. 1. I will not fund silence. 2. I will not trade self-respect for family optics. 3. I will not apologize for setting limits. 4. I will give only when it feels like a gift, not an expectation. 5. I will not fear being alone if the alternative is erasure. I folded the list and slipped it into the drawer where I used to keep blank checks. The next morning, I went for a drive without a destination. The road stretched out in front of me, long and open, flanked by trees just beginning to turn for fall. The radio played softly. The wind rolled through the cracked window. I didn't feel like a woman left behind. I felt like someone who had finally caught up to herself. When I got home, I found a voicemail from Daniel. He sounded tired, unsure. He said he hoped I was doing okay. He said they missed me. He said maybe we could talk soon. I saved the message, but I didn't return the call. Not because I was punishing him, not because I didn't care, but because I was finally free of the urgency that used to define me. I didn't need to rush to repair something just because it had cracked. Sometimes you let the fracture stay. You let the space speak, and if something is going to be rebuilt, it will have to be with new materials: respect, honesty, mutuality. Until then, I would live like this with everything under my name on my terms, in my hands. I lit a candle that night, not for ceremony, not for nostalgia, just because I wanted to. And in that small flame flickering gently in the quiet of my own home, I saw something I had been waiting to reclaim for years myself.